Good morning. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. If you're visiting, welcome. We're glad that you're here. This is our auditorium class for the adults, and glad that you are taking advantage of that opportunity. Going to pick up where we left off in a series of lessons we began recently. We introduced it a couple of weeks ago and spent last week with it. And we're dealing with a subject matter that was actually requested. And it was requested that we go over the offerings of the Old Testament. When you start reading in the book of Leviticus, you're initially introduced to some of the regulations and instructions for these various offerings. So kind of the way it was posed to me to present it in a lesson was, well, what would worship have looked like? What were these offerings? Why so many different? What are the particulars? And so we've been looking at that. We noted that most of the information is provided for us during the days of the traveling tabernacle. In other words, later there was the temple that was built that had all the same parameters, all the same particulars, but they were stationary in Jerusalem at the Temple Mount. Now, it's interesting, as you study the book of Hebrews, if you take the time to study the book of Hebrews, it's interesting how effort is made to talk about the particulars of the tabernacle when he's talking about worship and then making the parallels to Christ. And we're going to do that at the end of this series. But he's not talking about the temple worship as much as he is alluding to, the Hebrew author that is, this period of time where there was the traveling tabernacle. And the altar is the prominent item that we're zeroing in on. As we're talking about these offerings, with some exception, they're most commonly made on this altar, this roughly 8 by 8 foot altar that's described for us in a number of places in Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. And so the priests were the ones that were responsible for these various sacrifices. For lack of a better way to put it, the main one would have been a burnt offering. And this was something where it was an offering either from the herd or the flock. And by that, we're meaning it was either a bull or it was a sheep. And there were some specifics and parameters. So it was to be without blemish. There were some requirements of its gender and things like that. And we also noted that for this offering, with the exception of the daily offering, if there were circumstances where you brought the animal, you had the responsibility to sacrifice it, and then the priest would then exercise the service of doing the burnt offering on the altar. And so we talked about some of those particulars and laws governing the burnt offering. Now, what we attempted to do was give kind of an idea, when would there be a burnt offering? And that was part of the question that was posed initially. Well, every time someone was guilty of some violation, they had to bring an animal? Well, no. There was a daily offering that was made both in the morning and in the evening. And it's mentioned on a couple of different occasions, the particulars. And so that satisfied the sin. However, if you were guilty of some particular violations, for instance, in Leviticus 5 and Leviticus 6, it mentions if you're guilty of certain things that you bring this offering, in addition to the morning and evening sacrifice that happened every day. All right. And so we mentioned there were the daily offerings. And we mentioned you could, under certain circumstances, be required to bring your own individual trespass offering for certain violations, or if you were defiled. If you touched a dead body, for instance, or you'd been defiled by touching a dead carcass of an animal, those type things, when you were defiled, you had to then be consecrated. You had to go and make an offering, a burnt offering. All right? And that's detailed and outlined. Also, if you had made a vow and fulfilled that vow, and there's several things about vows that include a burnt offering. These would have been voluntary. Also, we see mandated that following childbirth and the purification of the mother, there was an offering made for that at the temple, and it would have included a burnt offering, and it depended upon your financial status as to what you brought. And the point we made, and it's been made before, when Jesus' mother came to the temple to make this offering, they made the pigeon or the turtle dove as part of their offering. Again, speaking about their humble financial status. All right, so we talked about the burnt offering. Now, we're going to talk this morning about the grain offering the drink offering, and the wave offering. And so I have a rather ambitious intention to get through all three of those. And those will be all of the main offerings. Yes, there are other things that we'll mention, but what I want to do after we get through these main ones is talk about the three feasts that are required and then what that looked like, because there were certain offerings that were made for those particular feasts. Then after that, my intention is to kind of, take us over to the book of Hebrews a little bit and talk about the foreshadowing or the parallels or the points that are made predominantly by the Hebrew author regarding how these relate to Christ as our high priest and Him making those services or sacrifices Himself for us as a high priest. All right, so let's talk about the grain offering. I ask you to go over to Leviticus chapter 2. Leviticus chapter 1 tells us about the burnt offering. Leviticus chapter 2 tells us about the grain offering. Sometimes it's referred to as a cereal offering or a cake offering. I must give you the disclaimer. When you think of cake, don't think of birthday cake or pineapple upside down cake or, pound cake or whatever you like. And when you think of cereal, don't think of Frosted Flakes or, Cinnamon Toast Crunch. What these were was grain, wheat and barley. But there were instructions that you made them into cake, or sometimes it's referred to as cereal. And the idea is that you made, I'm sure there are other cultures that still do a primitive type of meal or fried bread like this. But you would take the flour and you would then mix it with oil and you would make it into a cake, and then there were instructions for how you cooked it. We'll talk about that in a second. And so that became like a cake, or that became like what they would call cereal, where you put the grain in. And we've used those terms for totally different things, obviously. All right. If we go to Leviticus chapter 2, ever so briefly, just look at verse 1. When anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. It's also mentioned, verse 13, it requires that you include salt. Because everything tastes better with salt. Look at verse 13. And everything offered of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all the offerings you shall offer salt. All right, so here's some restrictions, some requirements. Now let me ask you, before you ask me, why in the world would you need to put frankincense in it? I don't know either. No, but I have done some research and there are some suggestions, although it's never expressly said in Scripture why. But frankincense was also used in the prescription or the recipe that we can look at later in Exodus 30 for the incense. You'll recall that the priest went in and burned incense. In fact, every morning they burned incense. In that incense, there's a recipe or a prescription. And it tells you everything's supposed to be in it. And one of those things is frankincense. And we might also note parallels to Jesus being offered the gifts of the wise men from the East who offered frankincense as one of the gifts. It was a very pleasing aroma. I couldn't tell you what frankincense smelled like. I'm not real good at that, but somebody else could. But the idea was that this was a desirable smell. Also, it wasn't cheap. And so the idea was when you brought your sacrifice, your offering, that it wasn't free, that it was costly. And what we'll note in a moment, we've noted this from the animal. They had monetary value in this agricultural system. So too did salt, incidentally. Salt wasn't free. So too did, when we mentioned the drink offering, they had to bring a lot of it. The drink offering most commonly obviously was wine. And so it wasn't cheap or inexpensive or without. In other words, you're giving this away. This could have been used in your home. The salt, the fine flour, the animals, all these are offerings. You're offering of your own produce. Not just produce you don't want, produce you don't need, produce that's blemished. Do you remember when we were kids? And I don't know if you're guilty of this, but I was in my household. They used to have these can drives, and a lot of times we'd either have them at school, or they'd even have them where you could take them and the post office would pick them up. Y'all remember that? Where you could put them in a sack and put them on your mailbox. I don't even know how that was distributed. I don't remember. But I can vividly remember having to take can drives and my mom saying, no, 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 don't take that. And she would like find me something in the back of the pantry, some yams or something. We didn't even remember why they were there. But the idea was you were giving of your best, and it was indeed a sacrifice. So here's some of the parameters. It has to be fine flour. You mix it with oil. It has to include salt and frankincense. And then there's some restrictions. If we look down at verse 11, no grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven. For you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. Now you might ask, why? And I would suggest, well, because God said so. I don't know if there are any particular express reasons. Now, leaven is often excluded from the bread or the grain or this cake or cereal that's mixed together. But don't know why honey is forbidden, except that maybe the byproduct of it being burnt. I don't know. Yeah, well, we can speculate as to the reasons. It may have been practical. It may have been ceremonial. It may have just been, here's what you do. Either way, these are some of the restrictions. And then he gives some instructions about how this grain offering is to be prepared. And what's interesting about this is there's some liberty. Like there's some freedom. If you're making a free will offering, and you're offering for a trespass offering or a peace offering, these offerings, you have some choice. It can be a bull from your herd, or it can be from your flock, or it can be from other occasions. And here's the same thing. If we drop down and look first at verse 4, he's given you some variety. If you bring an offering of a grain offering baked in the oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. So there's some variety, right? There's some options. He goes on to say you can basically fry it, verse 5. He mentions verse 4, it could be in an oven. Verse 5, if your offering is a grain offering baked in a pan, we would just say fried bread. In fact, there are cultures that, fry bread in a skillet. It should be a fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil, and he gives you some particulars. Or he says in verse 7, it could be in a covered pan. In other words, there are a variety of choices you have about how you cook it. And then he mentions another occasion of having the first fruit. In other words, when you go to the harvest. Now, this wouldn't happen every day. Okay, let me say this before I go any further. And I think this is the last point. No. I'll mention it in just a minute with the drink offering. The daily requirements of a sacrifice in the morning and a sacrifice in the evening of every day included not only a burnt offering, but a grain offering and a drink offering. And so this was something that was done perpetually throughout the year. But the harvest didn't come in every day. But when the harvest came in, there's some separate instructions for making an offering of the first fruit. Okay, verse 14 of Leviticus 2. If you offer a grain offering of your first fruit to the Lord, you shall offer for the grain offering of your first fruit green heads of grain roasted on the fire, grains beaten from full heads. And you shall put oil on it, lay frankincense on it, and its grain, it is a grain offering. And the priest shall burn a memorial portion, part of the beaten grain and part of its oil with its frankincense as an offering made by fire. And so there's a lot of instructions about portions. I'm not going into all that. There are other things that we could talk about. What do you do with the entrails? What do you do with the fat? I'm not going into all those details. And one of the details is who gets what. The Levitical priests, sons of Aaron's, they were able to keep a portion of these offerings. And there's some details in that we're not going to mention all of them, but we're going to mention a few of them. And one of them is mentioned here. And then these were burnt by the priests on the altar, along with the animal sacrifice, usually simultaneously. All right. Now I know that's a lot. I went through it quick, but I went through it quick on purpose. Let me pause. Questions?
I think you just touched on. I was going to ask you, as far as the priest of course takes what needs to be
burnt,
altar burnt, whatever, and then he gives the rest to Aaron and his son.
Mm-hmm.
So with everything going on and them doing things daily and everything, I'm just wondering how much Aaron and his son he gets
Well, you have to understand there was a pretty large number of people necessary to do these services. Plus, they were not allotted any land. If you remember from the book of Joshua, all of the tribes got land. And that land was sufficient for them to do what? Well, have animals, keep a flock, herds of cattle. Well, the Levites were not to do that. They were to reside in the center. And so they didn't have these same opportunities. And so their portion, their blessing, was not to raise the sheep, the various animals, but to get the portions of them of the people that brought them. We'll talk about this when we get to the wave offering and some specifics. In other words, burn most of it, but some of it's going to be kept for the sons of Levi. Now, you might remember in your studies that some of the priests took advantage of this. Eli's sons, for instance, you might remember. They took portions that were not to be designated for them. And that's a whole other particular about what they could keep and what they couldn't keep. It had to do with burning off the fat and those things. But those, I mean, look, if we get into those particulars, I mean, you've read the book of Leviticus, right? I mean, this will be a month series or 2 months or 5 months, and half of it will be, your eyes will be glazed over with all the details. Yes? Okay. No, most of the occasions are the same. In other words, when you look at these occasions, when someone brought an offering, they brought the offerings like you would on the daily offering. Because what we'll mention in just a moment, we look at the daily offerings, what did they bring? They brought a burnt offering. They also brought a grain offering, and they also brought a drink offering. And what would happen is they would offer the burnt offering animal, they would offer the grain cakes to be burned, and then they would pour wine over it, and they would burn it.
So, Joe, as far as level of sin, I'm saying it, but I know sin is a sin. When they're bringing these offerings and they're doing that daily offering or whatever, when you're bringing the grain offerings for a lesser sin, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, the daily offering was an atonement to appease God's wrath towards sin. And it was for Israel. And it was in the morning, and it was in the evening. Every morning, every evening. And the incense was burnt every morning to represent the prayers of the people coming up. And so this was done to appease God, as prescribed by God, incidentally. But as far as the particular occasions you might bring a trespass offering, there's only a few that are listed expressly in Leviticus 5 and 6 and a few other occasions. In other words, if you're guilty of this, and there's several mentioned, if you're guilty of this, you bring it. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it possible to exhaust everything you could be guilty of and write it down expressly? Well, I don't think so. I mean, if it was, the book would be 10 times the size, right? And so the idea was, under certain violations, you bring your offering. Independent and separate from what happens morning and evening. But it doesn't say every occasion you're to do that. Does that make sense? And to go back to your question, when they offered the grain offering, these same occasions would satisfy, right? And so even, this isn't exhaustive, right? It could be a vow fulfilled, it could be leprosy, a whole host of other things. Once you were deemed clean, then you made an offering. And that offering would be what? Well, for example, you might bring a sheep, your grain, fine flour mixed with oil, and then you would bring a third of a hin of wine. A hin is a measurement. And so you would take that and you would offer it to the priest. What would the priest do? He'd burn all that for you. Where? On the altar. Y'all with me? So you made your offering. Now, I can't tell you every occasion that you'd be required to make a sin offering or a trespass offering. There are a few express occasions. If you did this, bring it. If you did that, bring it. Read, for example, Leviticus 5 and 6. It'll list some of those occasions. But typically, if you were subject to and received the benefit of the morning and the evening sacrifice, unless you were guilty of certain violations, you didn't have to bring a trespass offering. All right. Does that make sense? Yes, Kenny?
Isn't it correct that any sin offering had to be of blood, had to be of an animal?
Yes. Yeah, they're highlighted.
Whereas the grain and the wine were more for thanksgiving, saying thank you, or just offering your praise and gratitude to God.
Not entirely. because there were Thanksgiving offerings that included burnt offerings, right? And there were, so we can't say exclusively that this type of offering didn't include an animal sacrifice. Most often, they would bring all three because that's what they did morning and evening.
Well, that wasn't what I was getting at. Mainly, it was actually the reverse of that. That the grain and the wine were not for sin because they don't contain blood. The blood has to be shed for sin offerings. So for sins, it was always the animal. You could, in addition to the sin offering, have your bread and wine offerings.
Yeah.
Bread and wine offerings and whatever, but those weren't for sin because there's no blood in wine or in grain.
Yeah, when we're looking at these sacrifices, they're almost invariably done in concert. In other words, you find, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know a few occasions, if any, where there were offerings that were made that weren't all of these offerings. In other words, when you came, you brought your grain offering, but you also brought your animal offering, and you also poured the wine over it. And so these things were done together. And there are a number of instances where you would do that voluntarily or by express compulsion. In other words, if you were guilty of something that was expressly mentioned, you had to bring such and such. But the grain offering is part of this overall burnt offering that's made. Questions about that any further before we look at drink offerings?
So many layers to this.
Let's talk about the drink offering. Will somebody quickly read for us Genesis 35 and verse 14? This is Jacob at Bethel.
Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, even a pillar of stone, and he poured the drink offering thereon, and he poured their oil thereon.
So we don't have a lot of particulars. I don't know how much. I don't know how it was prescribed. This is pre-law. I mean, there's not the law mandating any particulars. But here, for whatever reason, he made a drink offering. And like we mentioned before, when we looked at the patriarchs, and we spent some time, where they would build and erect altars and make burnt offerings. Even Noah did that way back in Genesis 8. But here we see the first mention or occasion of using a drink offering. Now, drink offerings are something that's been part of most pagan cultures. If we go over to Jeremiah chapter 20, not chapter 20, if we go over to Jeremiah chapter 44, look over there with me quickly. Look at Jeremiah chapter 44. Let's read a few verses here of what the people of God, incidentally and sadly, were doing. If we drop down there and look at verse 16. Look at verse 16. As for the word that you, that's speaking of Jeremiah, have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen, but we will certainly do whatever has gone out of our own mouths, to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her as we have done, we and our fathers, our kings and our princes in the city of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. So this was not an unknown practice or something that was not done among various pagan cultures to provide altars, to pour out drink offerings to the, quote, gods. In other words, you were sacrificing your wine so that they could consume it, essentially. Now, I do want to mention this. Let's go back to Exodus 29. We looked at Exodus, and incidentally, it's also in the book of Numbers, but we'll look at it here. Look at Exodus 29 and drop down to verse 38 there. Now, this is what you shall offer on the altar: 2 lambs of the first year, day by day, continually. 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. With the 1 lamb shall be 1/10 of an ephah of flour mixed with 1/4 a hin of pressed oil. Now let me stop here. Now an ephah, if you want to know, is half of a bushel, or roughly 22 liters, or it would be roughly 5 dry gallons. So it's a significant amount. And if you want to know the hin, it's roughly 3 liters. You can go get a 2 liter of Coke, but I remember when I was a kid, you could get a 3 liter. I don't know. I just remember as a kid getting a 3-liter, and it was usually the Coke that was called Cola, which meant it was generic. It was a 3-liter, and it wouldn't fit in that shelf in the side of the refrigerator. You had to put that right there in the middle. But that's essentially how much we're talking about, 3 liters, okay? That's what a hin is. Okay, so we're in verse 40. With the one lamb there shall be 1/10 of an ephah of flour, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of pressed oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine. And you shall offer with it the grain offering and the drink offering as in the morning for the sweet aroma, an offering made by fire to the Lord. So what'd you do in the morning and what'd you do in the evening? You brought a lamb, you brought your grain offering, and you brought your wine or drink offering, and you poured it over it. And then it all burned up. And then it was mixed with the frankincense and the salt, and it was unleavened and all these particulars. It was, all the particulars we read about the burnt offering. Does that make sense? So this will happen morning and evening. So if you brought that offering for your own trespass, then you brought those same articles. Unless, for the burnt offering, you substitute that with a turtle dove or a pigeon, and then the other particulars. And it was affordable. It was reasonable. Depends upon, in part, your financial status. But this, the drink offering, along with the grain offering and the burnt offering, were done every morning, every night for the people. In Numbers chapter 15, incidentally, I'm not going to read this, for time's sake and for your attention's sake, but you can read with each offering what a measure of a hin, H-I-N, you were to give as part of that drink offering. In other words, when you offer this animal, in other words, there's a difference between a bull and a sheep, there's a difference between the turtle dove, and then there's different grains. We mentioned you could prepare it several different ways. And so how much did you pour over it? You with me? Wine was almost exclusively what they poured over it. All right, you had a question?
Yeah, the part of the daily offerings, the 2 lambs with the drinks, is it 2 lambs for everybody, or everybody brought 2 lambs?
No. The priest would offer 1 lamb in the morning, 1 lamb in the evening, and with it the grain offering, and he would pour the stuff over it every day. Also, every morning, if we go to Exodus 30, we're going to look at it later. We won't get to it this morning. They burned incense every morning. The priest was responsible for doing that. And so these were things that happened every single day. All right, Tony?
Did the Lord prescribe this to Moses, or did this stuff
Yes.
Moses came up with?
Oh, no, it was given to Moses as a pattern, all of it. All of it was, this is what you're to do. And these are precise prescriptions for what they were to do. The precision is to the minutia, and to the point where most people just don't even study about this. I'm not trying to insult you, but most people just, when they read Leviticus, they're like, that doesn't pertain to me, right? And it doesn't, except for the foreshadowing, and except for some things that we appreciate and understand about offerings, or a priest, or a high priest, or sin, some of those things that are explained, and all of this layered together to present the picture of the cross. Rod?
That just goes to show you again how precise and how specific God was. And today it's like, church of choice, anything is good.
Sure.
However you feel in your heart, and all this, do your own thing.
Well, in the middle of all of these instructions in Leviticus, we get Leviticus chapter 10. Y'all remember Leviticus chapter 10? How it starts? That's Nadab and Abihu, right? And so right in the middle of all these instructions, we see somebody who did what? Well, they deviated from the instructions, really, I believe, in a very subtle way. And they made some assumptions. It was very subtle. It wasn't, I don't think it was some hugely overt thing, but it was, deviating from the details which they've been commanded. Where did they get those commandments, Tony? Moses. Where did Moses get them? From God. All right. Did you have a question? Comment?
So the vast majority of all these offerings, all the specifics, are really for the priest for morning and night, unless I felt like I had either committed some egregious sin and I was convicted by it, or if there was one of the prescribed things I had come in contact with.
Sure.
Or whatever, then I personally would go and make this drink offering, grain offering, sin offering, whatever.
You wouldn't make the offering, you would bring the offering. The services were all done by the priest. But yes, there were the morning and evening sacrifices.
Unless I had
there were some special things on the feast days that you were responsible for that we'll talk about when we get to the feast days. Then there are certain prescribed express occasions where you'd be violated, defiled, unconsecrated, be it that you touched a dead body or leprosy or, half a dozen other things that are mentioned expressly, that you had to bring an offering. Or you were guilty of certain trespasses. It talks about breaking a vow, a whole host of other things. But these were free will offerings with some express specifics. In other words, if you did this. Go read Leviticus chapter 5 and chapter 6. If you've been guilty of this, you've been guilty of that, you've been guilty of this. Now that's the whole point I made just a minute ago. Could we exhaust that? No. And so some of that was free will. Yes. All right. Interestingly enough, will somebody quickly read Philippians 2 and verse 17? Paul mentions drink offering a couple of occasions. On one, the most notable probably is 2 Timothy, where in 2 Timothy he said, the time of my departure is at hand, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. And what he was talking about in that regard was, that would be the last thing you do on the altar, incidentally. You've got the animal part, you've got the grain part, and then you pour the drink offering over it. You with me? And so he's saying, this is the end of my sacrifice. It's also kind of the idea, if you think about the hourglass, where you turn the sand over. It's like same thing with the drink offering. You pour it out slow. And he's like, this is the end, is what he's saying. But somebody read Philippians 2, verse 17.
Yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all.
See the imagery he's using? Their faith is the sacrifice on the altar, and he is the drink offering being poured over. It's the image back to here, right? And we find that parallel often, most often, obviously, the book of Hebrews. If you understand and appreciate some of the basics that we look at, it's amazing how much the book of Hebrews makes way more sense. And it was written to an audience that they did this every day. Or they knew of their, ancestors before them doing this daily. They knew what the Day of Atonement was. They knew about these offerings, and so he alludes to them and then makes parallels and draws them to Christ's sacrifice. All right. Any questions about the drink offering before? I told you I wanted to get through the wave offering, so we're almost there. Wave. Any questions about the drink offering? Okay. Let's talk about the wave offering, and then we'll wrap up for today, and hopefully we'll get through it. If we look at Exodus chapter 29, and incidentally we're already there, we should be, or at least the last one that we looked up was Exodus 29. Drop down to verse 24 there. And you shall put all these in the hands of Aaron. Now this is talking about the particulars of the offering. You can back up to get the specifics of the previous verses, but I want to zero in on this. Verse 24. And you shall put all these in the hands of Aaron and in the hands of his sons, and you shall wave them as a wave offering before the Lord. Now, can I get a volunteer super quick to read 2 Kings 5:11? When you read it, you'll be like, oh yeah, I knew that. 2 Kings 5:11. Somebody read that verse for us. Very familiar verse.
But Dan was angry and went away, saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over me, the place, and cure the leper.
Y'all remember this, right? That's Naaman. Naaman comes to the man of God who he knows can cure him, and he told him to do what? Go dip 7 times in the Jordan. He argued and said, isn't there better waters here? Do I really have to do that? I don't want to do that. And he was kind of mad. And he said, what I thought the man of God would do would be come out here, call upon the name of his God, and just wave his hand over it. Same word in the Hebrew. Wave. And so what literally they were doing, and we're going to look at some more of the particulars of this, when there was a burnt offering, they would, for lack of a better way to put it, they'd wave it first, and we'll look at the particulars. And again, you have to think, this is all part of the same process. We kind of are segregating these, but we have to think, when they came on the morning, they would come and they would bring the lamb, and all of the particulars you can read about, what we read in Leviticus 1. And then they're going to take the grain, all the stuff we read about in Leviticus chapter 2. And then they're going to take, once they've done those particulars, then they're going to pour wine over it. But before they did that with the burnt offering, they did something. All right, let's look at Leviticus chapter 7. Leviticus chapter 7. Let's start in verse 28 there. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. There's your answer, Tony. We alluded to that. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, He who offers the sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hand shall bring the offering made by fire to the Lord. The fat with the breasts he shall bring, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. So they're taking this animal and they're cutting it. We've already mentioned that Leviticus chapter 1 says they skinned it. Remember, they don't burn the skin. There's certain things they do with the entrails and the fat. We could look at those particulars if you want to get bogged down in Leviticus 1. And then he's going to take a portion of it, the breast, and he's going to wave it. Now, what in the world does that mean? He's going to wave it. Now, again, we're talking about the altar. He's taking the animal and he's waving it. Now, this is very similar to the heave offering, and this is interesting. Look at Leviticus chapter 7 and note verse 32. Look at verse 32. Also, from the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a heave offering from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. All right, so now heave means literally to lift up. Like heave, you lift it up. And so here's what the priest would do. He would take the breast and he would wave it. And then he would take this portion of the thigh, the right thigh, and he would heave it. Now, I'm not trying to be irreverent, but when I think of this, I often think of that scene in The Lion King. Where they took the, I don't know, what's the name? Everybody knows. See, that's why I use this illustration. Everybody knows it. You take Simba and he's like showing it and he's saying, this is my son and I'm kind of offering it to the gods. And that was the idea of you heave something up. I remember growing up Catholic, and the way that was done during the portion of the Mass of the Eucharist, the priest would take and hold up the Eucharist for everybody to see. And the idea was it was heaved up. And so what he's saying is when you come and you make these sacrifices, in the morning, in the evening, what do? Well, you take the animal, and then when you take the breast, you wave it. And I assume right to left, left to right, I don't know, just you wave it. But then you take this portion of the thigh, I couldn't think of the word. And then you heave it up. And the idea was it was part of the ceremony or part of the service of the priest. And then it also says that these, let me go back. These were for the priest. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 10. Look at Leviticus chapter 10. There's a lot said about what the priests get to keep. But I mention it here with this offering because he would wave the breast and he would heave the thigh in the process of them being burnt, but he would keep them. All right, drop down to verse 12 of Leviticus 10. And Moses spoke to Aaron and Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons who were left. Take the grain offering that remains and the offerings made by fire to the Lord, and eat it without leaven on the side of the altar, for it is most holy. You shall eat it in the holy place, because it is due, and because it is your due and your son's due of the sacrifices made by fire to the Lord, for it has been commanded. The breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering you shall eat in a clean place, you and your sons and your daughters with you, for they are your due. In other words, you didn't get a land allotment. These are your due. This is your payment. This is what you receive for your service. And so this was part of the offering. They weren't burned up. These portions were kept and eat. And incidentally, if you want to read about how they could eat it and what they were supposed to do, you can read about that too. The book of Leviticus is chock full of those meticulous details. All right, let's go back. Also, we failed to mention the grain was also something that was waved. And then let's read this and we'll be desperately close to the end of class, but hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for questions or comments. Look at verse 10 of Leviticus chapter 23. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you have come into the land which I have given you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And these were some particulars about harvest. Remember, harvest doesn't happen every day. Harvest only happens during certain times of the year, and there were certain prescriptions that you were to offer a wave offering of the first fruits of your grain. All right. I know I went fast. I went fast on purpose because this was my goal. My goal was to get through the grain offering, the drink offering, and the wave offering. So questions, comments, thoughts before we run out of time. I know it's a lot, but you can take note of it and go back and read some of these verses. If incidentally you wanted my slides, just email me. I'll be glad to send them to you. Oh, yes, there were restrictions of where they could eat it, yes.
Then they can take the meat home to their family.
Yes.
But the grain offering is only for them right beside the altar.
Yes, there were times that they were only supposed to eat certain things in certain places, but yes, the meat that they were to take home was to provide for their family as well. Absolutely. Good point. Do you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a reach, but it seems kind of interesting that they had like an animal or a blood sacrifice, grain and wine, and Christ, I guess, for us would be like the blood, and then we have the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. Is that like a symbolism?
Yeah, there is some symbolism there. I mean, behold, the what of God to take away the sins of the world? The Lamb of God, right? And so, yes, there's certainly undeniable parallels and foreshadowing to point to this old sacrificial system, because this is the ultimate sacrifice. All right, we've had our second bell. We'll have to end there. Lord willing, we'll pick up here next week, finish out a little bit that needs to be said about this, maybe review a tad, give you an opportunity if there are questions, and then we're going to look at those special feast days and some of the sacrifices there, and then make some parallels in our New Testament. And then that's my plan for this series. I appreciate your attention.